Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the people heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. If we were reading directly from Daniel chapter 2 into Daniel chapter 3, we would see that there is an immediate contrast between the two passages. Because Daniel 2 ended with the explanation that there's a coming kingdom that would overthrow all earthly kingdoms and would be founded upon a rock that was cut by no human hands. And yet, beginning in Daniel 3, the first thing that we see is a giant idol that is erected by whom? Nebuchadnezzar. It's lifted up by human hands. And again, this is a political and religious item. And so there's a direct contrast here between this kingdom of God that will never fail, not founded by any human, and the kingdom and political system of Nebuchadnezzar that is set up by his own hand. Likely, this statue is not of Nebuchadnezzar himself, but one of his patron deities, probably either Marduk or Nebu, based upon his own records and what we know of history. The size of the statue is also impressive. If anybody does the math and runs a quick conversion, a cubit's roughly 18 inches, and so if it's 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, it's 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. And we look at that and go, well, that's kind of an odd statue. It's really narrow and it's really tall, and that had to look kind of weird. But again, context is important. More than likely, the statue was set into the walls of the city rather than standing on its own on a pedestal or outside of basically freestanding. In that context, the walls of the city stood 295 feet high and they were 79 feet thick. It would have been set into a recessed niche, and so you have only seen it in profile. And in that context, the statue makes sense. Daniel here also seems to be indulging in a bit of satire by creating a contrast between the officials and the ceremony with the eventual actions of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And that contrast is set up with the description of the pagan officials and the content of the ceremony. And we see this first because there's a repetition of all those that are gathered before the statue. A normal person, either writing or speaking, after giving that whole list of officials, do you think they would have gone through and said it all a second time? I am not willing to do that on my own. I'm inherently a lazy person. If I can get it out in one go and then just say, and all those officials that were gathered, I'm going to do that. However, Daniel uses that repetition to drive home that those gathered in front of the statue included the whole of the empire, both pagan and Jewish. And it also sets up the universal and automatic obedience of all those gathered together. There's no pause to question, there's no pause to think, there's no pause to pull in their own religious identities and say, do we agree with this? It's automatic. The second thing we see that's indulging in some irony here is the phrase stood before in verse 3. This is a Hebrew idiom, here written in Aramaic, but it's pulled from the Hebrew. And most often where we see it in the Old Testament is in relation to standing before God to worship. So Leviticus 9:5, and they brought what Moses commanded, which was a sin offering, in front of the tent of meeting, and all the congregation drew near and stood before the Lord. 2 Kings 5:16, but he, being Elisha, said, as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he, Naaman, then took away the offering. And so there's again this contrast of what is actually occurring at the statue. And then third, we get the idea that the scope of what is happening in front of the statue is meant to be impressive. It's meant to, awe and overwhelm everyone that's there. And again, this is done through taking this long list of instruments. And not only do they tell you the first time, what do they also do? They tell you a second time. Daniel wants you to understand that this was not some quiet ceremony. This was pomp and circumstance of the highest degree. This is also emphasized by the warnings against disobedience. Being cast into a burning fiery furnace was not an uncommon form of punishment in the ancient Near East. We know from the historical records that the Babylonians, the Persians, and the Greeks all used it as a form of punishment. In fact, there's other references within the Old Testament, Jeremiah 29:22. Because of them, this curse shall be used by all exiles from Judah and Babylon. The Lord make you like Zedekiah and Ahab, whom the king of Babylon roasted in the fire. I'm sorry? That reference is Jeremiah 29:22. So again, we've got this picture of this very large, impressive ceremony in which people are showing up, they're bowing the knee, there's no thought, there's no correlation to what's going on, to what their actual identity and purpose is. And then we reach verses 8 through 12. Therefore, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Now, to this point in the narrative, we have not actually seen Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. When they do show up in the text, it's not from their own actions, it's from the report of the Chaldean officials. And we gather from the text that the charges that are brought against them are not motivated by any concern for protecting the authority or rule of Nebuchadnezzar. The text indicates most translations, modern translations, use the term maliciously accused. But again, this is pulled from the Hebrew, and the idiom that's used in the original language is much stronger. The literal phrasing of the statement, if translated literally, is, "And they ate their pieces, which were of the Judeans." And that has that image of they're grinding them up. They're trying to crush them down and turn them into a pulp. And so the idiom there, "to eat the pieces of," indicates a willful attempt at destruction. Notice also that those bringing the charge belong to the Chaldean court officials. And again, this follows from Daniel 2. Who in Daniel 2 was not able to interpret the king's dream? The Chaldean court officials. And so there's this element of this is not about political authority or religious authority or anything else. This is about revenge. And their charge against the men is threefold in nature. Verse 12, it says, "These men, O king, pay no attention to you." And so they start off focusing on the civil disobedience that Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael are engaging in. And this is emphasized by the fact that they repeat the previous command of the ceremony. And so again, they're not going just after the religious reasons, they're going after the civil reasons as the primary method of attack. They may be attempting to overthrow these three, but they don't want it to appear to be out of jealousy outright. Then we get to the latter part of verse 12, and it says, "They do not serve your gods." And again, this strikes at the religious core in that the three men are not willing to compromise their religious beliefs and violate the first commandment. And again, to this point, we've seen that Daniel and the three were willing to make some concessions. They were willing to be given Babylonian names. They were willing to learn the language. They were willing to be educated by the Babylonians. However, the litmus test here is not just the civil obedience of what they're doing here, it's also the religious. Because it says in the Aramaic, the stress in the construction is on your gods. They will not worship your gods. And this is going to be paralleled then in verses 14 and 15 when Nebuchadnezzar confronts them. And so we get to this point where here's the thing they will not compromise on. They'll take a name, they'll take an education, they'll live, they'll breathe, they'll work in this kingdom. Here is where they will not compromise. And then again in verse 12 it says, they do not worship the golden image that you have set up. And again, we have this blending of the religious and the political in that they will not bow to the idol because it's going against their religion, but then that is twisted into this political realm as well. Verses 13 through 15. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship that image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? We need to understand that when Nebuchadnezzar brings these three men in and questions them, he's not actually questioning them. He's not trying to gain more information. He's not trying to probe them for motives. He's not trying to see where their loyalties actually lie. Rather, his questions and the statements that are made afterwards are there to give notice to the three men that their actions are a mistake and they better fall into line. And this isn't just about getting them to be obedient to the command, it's about making sure that everyone else around them knows that obedience is the best option. There is to be no questioning about their loyalty to the king outside of the act of worshiping the idol or any attempt to blum their motives. It's a straightforward demand for obedience through a physical act to demonstrate their loyalty. All the same, again, that physical act is loaded with religious meaning. And notice that it's stated twice in his statements that the act demanded requires worshiping his gods. Nebuchadnezzar's last statement in this dialogue tends to give translators a bit of a fit because of the verb usage is difficult. Most translations render the last question in a similar form to, and what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? And again, this is not an actual interrogative statement. He's not asking for the name of their God or who they think could deliver them. Rather, it's a rhetorical statement based upon Nebuchadnezzar's beliefs in the superiority of his own gods. In effect, he's stating, your lesser God cannot overcome my gods and save you. Verses 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. If we were in the modern day, their answer would be accompanied by a series of finger snaps or a mic drop, because they just went full-blown hardcore response to Nebuchadnezzar. We lose some of this in the text in our modern theories and thinking of language and things like that. But their statement in response is blunt, to say the least, and there's no quarter given. Verse 16, we have no need to answer you in this matter. In effect, you've just demanded of us an act of loyalty. Guess what? Not going to do it. Not going to give a response, not going to give a reasoning. We're just not going to do it. Verse 17 then gives the confidence of these men in the existence of God and his power to save. The conditional statement that begins that phrase, where they say, excuse me, let's see here. If this be so, is again one of those phrases that's been difficult to translate. Within different translations, you'll see it phrased differently. The Holman Christian Standard Bible phrases it, if the God we serve exists, which is the most literal translation of the Aramaic. And that makes it sound like, well, maybe their God exists, maybe it doesn't. That's not actually the full extent of what they're saying to Nebuchadnezzar. Because this isn't a statement as to the uncertainty or the conditional existence of God. And some of the other translations try to avoid this ambiguity because they try to keep it as close to a literal translation as possible, but they still miss the rhetorical thrust somewhat. And so I'm reading from the ESV. It says, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able. And a lot of translations will follow that. But that conditional statement is intended to convey the full assurance that God exists, and that because God exists, it is possible that he may save them. And so if we wanted to be a little bit more fluid in the language, but a little bit true to the content, it would be because our God exists, if you decide to throw us in the fiery furnace, he may or may not decide to save us. This confidence in God's dominion over the false gods of Babylon and his ability to save them is extended by them, even so that if God does not save them at all, what's their response? We still will not serve your gods or worship the golden image. And we need to stop and think about that confidence and statement there. Our God exists, and if he so chooses, he will save us. But even if he does not, we still will not bow the knee. These men are placing themselves fully in God's hands in relation to what may happen to them. Come positive outcome, come negative outcome. Their confidence is in God. Verses 19 through 23. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. So, you're the ruler of a mighty kingdom, and these 3 upstarts have just looked at you and said, ha ha ha, no. What is your response? In the case of Nebuchadnezzar, his response is to fly off the handle. It says the countenance of his face was changed against these men. This has the idea that if he had any goodwill towards them at any point in the past, it is now gone. The command then to set the fire, to fire the furnace, it says 7 times more than it was usually heated. This is more than likely hyperbole. They're not sitting there with a oven thermometer and going, okay, we're normally at 250, let's get it up to, 7 times 2, whatever that is. 1,450, no, it'd be more than that. Anyway, hot. It's intended to be, I don't want them just burned. I want them burned as much as possible. I want my anger to be matched by the raging of the furnace. Nebuchadnezzar's rage is also such that the order cannot be slowed down or done in a normal way. Because again, if you're being executed by the state, normally there's ceremony and there's, things that happen, right? And so normally, they would have been taken as prisoners, they would have been stripped down, they would have been, processed through, and they would have been taken out and executed in that manner. That doesn't happen here. His rage is so great that he says, bind them right now. Skip all the other stuff that we would normally do. They're still wearing their hats, their cloaks, and their official gear as satraps. Guess what? I don't care. Bind them up and throw them in the fire. There's also a bit of irony here that's set up in verse 22, because who is intended to be killed by his command? Well, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, right? And yet, who ends up dying? Yeah, his own men. Because of the rashness of his order, because of the overflow of his anger, he inflicts death upon his own people. Yes?
I read in an archaeology report magazine on this, that there are natural gas fissures in that area, and they could control the heat of the furnace by making those fissures wider or not. So it's a possibility.
Okay, so Mom pointed out that there are fissures in the earth around Babylon that allowed natural gas to seep up, that they built furnaces over, and that they could control the temperature. That is very true. But the statement 7 times, it's hyperbole. He wants what happens to them to match his anger at them. But yes, there is historical record that furnaces existed like what they get chucked into. So this also then explains how they're able to come out of the furnace later because of the way they were shaped. It's basically like a big pizza oven. There's a door on the front. You can walk in, you can walk out. Anyway. That's a good question. Dave asked, where's Daniel in all this? We don't know. He's not in the narrative. You would assume Daniel, with his character and everything else that's happened within the context of the rest of the book, he's not one of the people bowing the knee, but he's also not somebody that's brought attention to in this context. So, I don't know. He's writing the story. Verses 24 through 27. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. The transition in the narrative is abrupt. Because if you're recounting a miracle, what would you expect to have happen between they're thrown in the furnace and Nebuchadnezzar is astonished? How do we normally tell this story to kids? We normally tell it as they're thrown in the fire, but God protects them, and then Nebuchadnezzar sees them, and then he exclaims. And yet, what happens in the narrative? We go directly from they're tossed into the fiery furnace to we skip, Nebuchadnezzar sees them, he does this, to immediately he's astonished. And if we skip over the fact that we've heard the story so many times and we read it in the narrative, that abrupt change, that shock, is meant to translate over to us. Something radical has just happened. We don't know what it is yet. But whatever it is, it shocks Nebuchadnezzar out of his current state. And that's meant to emphasize this miraculous event that has happened. It's meant to emphasize God's presence with his people. The question and statement by Nebuchadnezzar that he sees 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire is a clear indicator that something radically unusual is happening. And we see this in how they are described. The thing that astonishes Nebuchadnezzar once we start to get clued in on what's happening. And the first thing that we see is that the removal of the bonds, that the men are up and walking around in the fire. They are no longer restricted. Which is then also the second thing that is unusual about what he sees. Because people that are thrown into a burning fiery furnace normally don't stand up and walk around. Right? You've got other things on your mind other than taking a stroll. And this is repeated later with their examination. There's no damage to them. There's no harm to their clothes. There's no smell of fire upon them. And then the third thing that really shocks and awes Nebuchadnezzar is that he sees someone there that has the appearance like a son of the gods. Now, there's debate on whether or not the person that's seen in the fire with Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael is an appearance of the pre-incarnate Christ or if it's an angel. The text itself isn't clear in indicating if it's an angel or not. It just says in verse 28, refers to the person as an angel sent by God. Now, you can go through the whole history of the Old Testament. You can talk about appearances of the angel of the Lord appearing, and if that's in a pre-incarnate Christ, and so the debate rages on. However, Nebuchadnezzar's declaration is clear, and it's a clear indication that he thought that the person in the fire shares in divinity. What he saw made him think this is someone who belongs with the gods. And so Andrew Steinman, in his commentary on Daniel, contends that this may be a case of Nebuchadnezzar referring to something in pagan terms, but still speaking more truth than what he understands. Steinman says, even though Nebuchadnezzar himself, lacking faith, could not have had a true spiritual comprehension of the identity of this person, his words may have expressed more than he himself fully understood. And Daniel, the author, may well have included his words as a form of irony. Similarly, John the Apostle records the words of the high priest Caiaphas, who said it was better for Jesus to die for his people so they would not perish, and his words express a theological truth far greater than he realized. Thus, it is possible that Nebuchadnezzar is describing a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ in terms that he, a pagan, would use. Therefore, the church fathers and Christian theologians may well have been correct in their contention that the fourth man was indeed the Savior. All that to say, do we know definitively? No, we do not. But God, in some way, shape, or form, made his presence with these men visible and known. Not just that he miraculously saved them, but that he visibly demonstrated his protection over them by the appearance of either the pre-incarnate Christ or an angel. Verses 28 through 30. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And so we reach the end of the narrative. And what's the end result of everything that has happened here? Well, we have two stunning admissions by Nebuchadnezzar. First, in contrast to anything that he has said or done up to this point, he admits that there is indeed a God that is greater than his God. That rhetorical question he asked earlier about what God of yours can come and save you, just got flipped on its head. And we see this in the text because there's a verbal parallel in the way that Nebuchadnezzar says, "Who can deliver you?" in verse 15, to what he says now that your God has delivered you. And so it's coming back on itself. He's answered his own question. And the second thing we see is that the defiance of the three and refusing his command was right and proper. Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges this. It was right and proper for you to defy me. And why does he say that? Because there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Notice that the three are not referred to as Nebuchadnezzar's servants at this point. Instead, they're referred to as servants of God. And so there's even this flip as to how they serve, what they do, who they are. They're no longer just his employees in the kingdom. They are servants of the true God. And with this, there's an admission that their faith was not misplaced as they yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. And this brings about in Nebuchadnezzar not conversion, but at least acknowledgement that God is to be reverenced. His edict at the end doesn't have the marks of repentance, it doesn't have the marks of true faith, but it does have the marks of a proper respect for God in that it recognizes that blasphemy against him is a serious offense. This edict then is also extended to all those who had previously pursued any god as a means of getting along or out of situations using religious pluralism. Because notice that there's the parallel use of people, nation, or language in this edict. The same thing that he had said earlier to everybody else: fall down, worship my gods, be all nice and religiously pluralistic, acknowledge my rule over you, acknowledge the sovereignty of my gods over your gods, is now inverted into all those same nations, peoples, and languages. He sends the commands that you do not blaspheme this God. You do not mix the worship of this God with these gods. He's different. And so we have to ask the question, so what? What does any of this have to do with us today? Well, a couple things. First, it is possible to live and function in a pagan culture by making certain accommodations, but there comes a point when no accommodation can be made. Again, we touched on this earlier. Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael are willing to accommodate to a certain point. They will take on certain names, they will live in a certain culture, they will serve a pagan king, but there is a line they will not cross. You could even argue the fact that the reason the names Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are used throughout this passage instead of their proper Jewish names is to highlight this point. That there's a certain extent to which they will go, but they will not cross, to the point that they're willing to be identified by false names, and yet they still will not serve a false god. They have been given names that should be transformative of identity, and yet they refuse to transform on what absolutely matters. And so what happens is there comes a point where not everything is negotiable. We live in a world that is fallen and full of sin, and in which we are a minority, in which we are not historically the dominant power, in which moving forward in history, we will again not be the dominant power. And we are faced with black and white issues, and we are faced with issues that exist in shades of gray. And sometimes the choices that we make to either work with the culture or to fight against the culture are going to be black and white. Other times, they will not be. In any case, we do not cross the line on what absolutely matters, even when refusing to cross that line is going to cause us great personal suffering and possibly even death. And we look at the culture around us today and we say, is this pertinent? Does this matter in the age in which we live? And most of us are going to have to shake our heads and say yes. 40 years ago, this wouldn't have seemed as applicable as it does today. And yet we are constantly asked to capitulate, to give ground, to move forward with the culture. And as a church, we need to stop and say, no. There are certain things I will not compromise on. Do your worst to me. My God exists. He may save me, he may not. It doesn't matter. If he doesn't, so what? I still will not cross this line. This is especially well contrasted in this passage if the historical context is accurate. Because if the historical context is accurate, Zedekiah, the king of Jerusalem, the person that should have been leading the people that were still in Judah, that should have been a righteous and good ruler of the people, that should have been leading them in the proper worship of God by example, shows up at Babylon, and what does he do? He bends the knee. He worships the idol. He capitulates to the world. These three exiles are willing to stand out alone against the entire crowd in order to maintain the proper worship and authority of God. And so, again, tying into Jeremiah 24, the vision of the two baskets of figs Jeremiah has. There's one of good figs, which is the exiles that are taken to Babylon, and there's one of bad figs, which are those of Zedekiah and his court, is made concrete in reality in this historical narrative. The second thing that we can take from this is that sometimes our resistance to the pressures of the cultures should be as simple as, no, that's wrong. The king of Judah is willing to compromise, degrade the worship of God in exchange for continuing his position. I just skipped ahead and read above in my notes, so ignore that last sentence. Here we go. There is a time to soften rhetoric in order to communicate clearly and lovingly with the culture. Are we supposed to be winsome? Are we supposed to be attractive, or are we supposed to pull people into the knowledge and love of Christ? Everybody nod your heads, yes. Absolutely we are. However, there will come a time when polemics and hard stances are necessary. And sometimes it's going to take the mic drop or the finger snap and saying, no, I owe you no other answer other than, I will not, that is wrong, because God exists. The response of Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah lacks the tact of Daniel in previous chapters, but it does not lack in stating the truth clearly. Third, we should take away from this that there's once again a repeated emphasis on God's uniqueness and ability to intervene and save his people, more so in this account directly than in the previous two accounts, with the intervention of a divine messenger. Now, most of us have put in a situation where we are going to be confronted and forced into do this or die, are not going to expect to see a divine messenger intervene and rescue us. That does not negate the fact that God is that powerful, that our God reigns and rules over any false god the world may set up, and that our confidence is in him. And then fourth and finally, I would add to that, though, we should not expect a miraculous deliverance like occurred here. We should expect that the path to glorification will lead through suffering. In the case of these three, it occurs immediately in a temporal sense, because their unwillingness to compromise leads to suffering by being thrown into a furnace and then immediate glorification. Our process might be much slower. It might involve living in a culture for the next 50 years in which our freedoms and our beliefs are slowly attacked, removed from us, and we're persecuted and made a minority. Never to the point of death, but always to the point that we become more and more hated, more and more marginalized, more and more set on the edge where we can be treated poorly and nobody will say anything. And that glorification might only come upon eventual death, and ultimately will only come when Christ returns and establishes his kingdom. And yet, patiently enduring that suffering will lead to glorification. Either way, our willingness to stand firm in the face of persecution or suffering is the bellwether by which the world can judge the truth of our beliefs and our commitment to them. And so we need to be willing to suffer well. Questions on Daniel 3?
Well, not a question, but in Romans and later on Peter emphasize that we should obey the authorities because they're set up by God. But there is that line from.
Yep. So Dave made the point that we are indeed commanded to obey the authorities. Romans 13, 1 Peter makes very clear that these people have been set over us. They are there to rule us. We are to be obedient. And yet, in spite of that, the biblical narrative was also clear. There are lines you do not cross. So, anything else?
Is there third-party verification for this story in the records of Babylon? Have you ever found evidence of this story?
So Kyle asked if there's third-party verification. In other words, do we have historical records of these things occurring outside of the narrative in Daniel? No, not like we don't have another. It's not like we've got Herodotus or somebody else writing history that brings these things in. As Mom mentioned earlier, we do have historical confirmation that things like the furnaces existed. We have indications that the niches in the walls that the statues and the idols would have been put in existed. So we have confirmation of details, things like that make the story within the bounds of history. So, anything else? Okay. Well, with that, we are done. Oh, real quick. We're traveling this week. We should be back by Sunday, but just in case, I've got Dan teaching next week in here. So he will be filling in. Last I talked to him, he was planning on going through Revelation 5, which I think will kind of book in neatly into some ideas we'll touch on in Daniel. So Dan will be teaching in here next week.